Alright, so I'm reading from Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski. In the preface to the first edition, it was noted that you can read a few. You can read book 3, book 2 alone, along with some preliminary pages to get the full gist, and so that's what I will be doing. And so I'm going over pages 15 and 16 and chapter 2 in this recording. Before we get to book 3, I will also be reading chapter 4, and then I will be going to book 2. Sorry, I keep saying book 3. And then I will start book 2. It's like 100 pages or so, book 2. So, so it was noted to know this table for the abbreviations that will be used, and this table for abbreviations, and I have written everything down, so I'll just keep this over here while I read. And chapter 2 starts here, so I will begin. Terminology and meanings, chapter 2. The representation of mental phenomena in the form of reactions, conditioned reflexes, Beck-Terrou's psychoreflexes, leads to a truly physiological schematization. Henry Piron. Now, I claim that the ethnographer's perspective is the only relevant and real for the formation of fundamental linguistic conceptions and for the study of the life of languages, whereas the philologist's point of view is fictitious and irrelevant. To define meaning, to explain the essential grammatical and lexical characters of language on the material furnished by the study of dead languages, is nothing short of preposterous in the light of our argument. B. Malinowski. If he contend, as sometimes he will contend, that he has defined all his terms and proved all his presuppositions, then either he is a performer of logical miracles or he is an ass, and as you and I know, logical miracles are impossible. Cassius J. Kaiser. Finally, in semantic aphasia, the full significance of words and phrases is lost. Separately, each word or each detail of a drawing can be understood, but the general significance escapes. An act is executed upon command though the purpose of it is not understood. Reading and writing are impossible, as well as numeration, the correct use of numbers, but the appreciation of arithmetical processes is defective. A general conception cannot be formulated, but details can be enumerated. Henry Piron. Moreover, the aphasic patient in his mode of life, in his acts, and in all his behavior may seem biologically and socially normal, but he has nevertheless suffered an unquestionable loss, for he no longer has any chance of undergoing further modifications of social origin and of reacting in his turn as a factor in evolution and progress. Henry Piron. Particularly, it expresses that most important step in the treatment, the passing over from a mere intellectual acceptance of the facts of the analysis, whether in interpretation of the underlying complexes or in recognition of the task to be accepted, to an emotional appreciation and appropriation of the same. Intellectual acceptance can work no cure, but may prove seriously misleading to the patient who is attempting to grasp the situation, and to the beginner in analysis as well. Smith, Eli Jalliffe. Section A, on semantic reactions. The term semantic reaction is fundamental for the present work and non-elementalistic systems. The term semantic is derived from the Greek semantikos, significant, from semanian, to signify, to mean, and was introduced into literature by Michael Brill in his essay De Semantique. The term has been variously used in a more or less general or restricted sense by different writers. Of late, this term has been used by the Polish school of mathematicians, and particularly L. Twistak, see Supplement 3, and we will, A.F. Bentley, and has been given a medical application by Henry Head in the study of different forms of aphasias. Aphasia, from the Greek aphasia, speechlessness, is used to describe disorder in comprehension or expression of written and spoken language, which result from lesions of the brain, disturbances of the semantic reactions in connection with faulty education and ignorance, must be considered in 1933 as submicroscopic colloidal lesions. Among the many subdivisions of the symbolic disturbance, we find semantic aphasia to be described after Head as the want of recognition or the full significance or intention of words and phrases, combined with the loss of power or appreciation, the ultimate non-verbal meaning of the words and phrases to be investigated presently, and the failure to recognize the intention or goal of actions imposed upon the patient. The problems of meaning are very complex and too little investigated, but it seems that psychologists and philosophers are not entirely in sympathy with the attitude of neurologists. It is necessary to show that in a non-Aristotelian system, which involves a new theory of meanings based on non-elementalistic semantics, the neurological attitude towards meaning is the only structurally correct and most useful one. The explanation is quite simple. We start with the negative non-Aristotelian premise. The words are not the unspeakable objective level, such as the actual objects outside of our skin and our personal feelings inside our skin. It follows that the only link between the objective and the verbal world is exclusively structural, necessitating the conclusion that the only content of all knowledge is structural. Now, structure can be considered as a complex of relations, and ultimately as multidimensional order. From this point of view, all language can be considered as names either for unspeakable entities on the objective level, be it things or feelings, or as names for relations. In fact, even objects as such could be considered as relations between the submicroscopic events and the human nervous system. If we inquire that the last relations represent, if we inquire what the last relations represent, we find that an object represents an abstraction of low order produced by our nervous system as a result of the submicroscopic events acting as stimuli upon the nervous system. If the objects represent abstractions of some order, then obviously when we come to the inquiry as to language, we find that words are still higher abstractions from objects. Under such conditions, a theory of meaning looms up naturally. If the objects as well as words represent abstractions of different order, and individual A cannot know what B abstracts unless B tells him, and so the meaning of the word must be given by a definition. This would lead to the dictionary meanings of words, provided we could define all our words. But this is impossible. If we were to attempt to do so, we should soon find that our vocabulary was exhausted, and we should reach a set of terms which could not be any further defined from lack of words. We thus see that all linguistic schemes, if analyzed far enough, would depend on a set of undefined terms. If we inquire about the meaning of a word, we find that it depends on the meaning of other words used in defining it, and that the eventual new relations positioned between them ultimately depend on the multiordinal meanings of the undefined terms, which at a given period cannot be elucidated any further. Naturally, any fundamental theory of meaning cannot avoid this issue, which must be crucial. Here, a semantic experiment suggests itself. I've performed this experiment repeatedly on myself and others, invariably with similar results. Imagine that we are engaged in a friendly, serious discussion with someone and that we decide to inquire into the meanings of words. For this special experiment, it is not necessary to be very exacting, as this would enormously and unnecessarily complicate the experiment. It is useful to have a piece of paper and a pencil to keep a record of the progress. We begin by asking the meaning of every word uttered, being satisfied for this purpose with the roughest definitions. Then we ask the meaning of the words used in the definitions, and this process is continued usually for no more than 10 to 15 minutes until the victim begins to speak in circles, as for instance defining space by length and length by space. When this stage is reached, we have come usually to the undefined terms of the given individual. If we still press, no matter how gently, for definitions, a most interesting fact occurs. Sooner or later, signs of affective disturbances appear. Often the face reddens, there is a bodily restlessness, sweat appears, symptoms quite similar to those seen in a schoolboy who has forgotten his lesson, which he knows but cannot tell. If the partner in the experiment is capable of self-observation, he invariably finds that he feels an internal affective pressure connected, perhaps with the rush of blood to the brain, and probably best expressed in some such words as what he knows but cannot tell, or the like. Here we have reached the bottom and the foundation of all non-elementalistic meanings, the meanings of undefined terms, which we know somehow but cannot tell. In fact, we have reached the unspeakable level. This knowledge is supplied by the lower nerve centers. It represents effective first-order effects and is interwoven and interlocked with other affective states, such as those called wishes, intentions, intuitions, evaluation, and many others. It should be noticed that these first-order effects have an objective character, as they are unspeakable, are not words. Meaning must be considered as multi-ordinal term, as it applies to all levels of abstractions, and so has no general content. We can only speak legitimately of meanings in the plural. Perhaps we can speak of the meanings, although I suspect that the latter would represent the unspeakable first-order effect, the effective personal raw material out of which our ordinary meanings are built. The above explains structurally why most of our thinking is to such a large extent wishful and is so strongly colored by affective factors. Creative scientists know very well from the observation of themselves that all creative work starts as a feeling, inclination, suspicion, intuition, hunch, or some other unspeakable affective state, which only at a later date, after a sort of nursing, takes the shape of a verbal expression worked out later in a rationalized, coherent linguistic scheme called a theory. In mathematics, we have some astonishing examples of intuitively proclaimed theorems which at a later date have been proven to be true, although the original proof was false. The above explanation, as well as the neurological attitude toward meaning, as expressed by Head, is non-elementalistic. We have not legitimately split organismal processes into intellect and emotions. These processes, or the reactions of the organism as a whole, can be contemplated at different neurological stages in terms of order, but must never be split or treated as separate entities. This attitude is amply justified structurally and empirically in daily and scientific life. For instance, we may assume that educated Anglo-Saxons are familiar with the Oxford Dictionary, although it must be admitted that they are handicapped in the knowledge of their language by being born into it. Yet we know from experience how words which have one standard definition, carry different meanings to and produce different effective individual reactions on different individuals. Past experiences, the knowledge of past experiences, etc. Past experiences, the knowledge, etc., of different individuals are different, and so the evaluation effective of the term is different. We are accustomed to such expressions as "it means nothing to me," even in cases when the dictionary wording is accepted, or "it means a great deal to me," and similar expressions which indicate that the meanings of meanings are somehow closely related to or perhaps represent the first order unspeakable affective states or reactions. Since knowledge then is not the first order unspeakable objective level, whether an object or feeling, etc., structure, and so relations becomes the only possible content of knowledge and of meanings. On the lowest level of our analysis, when we explore the objective level, the unspeakable feelings in this case, we must try to define every meaning as a conscious feeling of actual or assumed or wished, etc., relations which pertain to first-order objective entities, psychological, psychological included, and which can be evaluated by personal, varied, and racial, again, unspeakable, first-order psychophysiological effects. Because relations can be defined as multidimensional order, both of which terms are non-elementalistic, applying to senses and mind after naming the unspeakable entities, all experience can be described in terms of relations or multidimensional order. The meanings of meanings in a given case, in a given individual, at a given moment, etc., represent composite effective psychological configurations of all relations pertaining to the case, colored by past experiences, state of health, mood of the moment, and other contingencies. If we consistently apply the organism as a whole principle to any psychological analysis, we must conjointly contemplate at least both aspects of the emotional and the intellectual, and so deliberately ascribe emotional factors to any intellectual manifestation and intellectual factors to any emotional occurrence. That is why, on human levels, the elementalistic term psychological must be abolished and a new term psychological introduced in order that we may construct a science. From what has been said, we see that not only the structure of the world is such that it is made up of absolute individuals, but that meanings in general and the meanings of meanings in particular, the last representing probably the unspeakable first-order effects, also share in common with ordinary objects the absolute individuality of the objective level. The above explains why, by the inherent structure of the world, life, and the human nervous system, human relations are so enormously complex and difficult, and why we should leave no stone unturned to discover beneath the varying phenomena more and more general and invariant foundations on which human understanding and agreement may be based. In mathematics, we find the only model in which we can study the invariance of relations under transformations, and hence the need for future psychologicians to study mathematics. It follows from these considerations that any psychological occurrence has a number of aspects, an affective and an intellectual, a physiological, a colloidal, and whatnot. For the science of psychophysiology, resulting in a theory of sanity, the above four aspects are of most importance, as our actual lives are lived on objective, unspeakable levels and not on verbal levels. It appears as a problem of evaluation, then, that the objective level, including, of course, our unspeakable feelings, emotions, etc., is the most important, and that the verbal levels are only auxiliary, sometimes useful, but at present often harmful because of the disregard of the semantic reaction. The role of the auxiliary verbal levels is only fulfilled if these verbal processes are translated back into first-order effects. Thus, through verbal intercourse, in the main, scientists discover useful first-order abstractions, objective, and by verbal intercourse again, culture is built, but this only when the verbal processes after the unspeakable psychological manifestations, such as our feelings, emotions, etc. Some extraordinary parrot could be taught to repeat all the verbal wisdom of the world, but if he survived at all, he would be just a parrot. The repeated noises would not have affected his first-order effects. These noises would mean nothing to him. Meanings and the meanings of meanings, with their inseparable affective components, give us, therefore, not only the non-elementalistic foundation on which all civilization and culture depends, but a study of the non-elementalistic mechanisms of meanings through psychophysiology and general semantics. Give us also powerful physiological means to achieve a host of desirable and to eliminate a large number of undesirable psychological manifestations. The physiological mechanism is extremely simple and necessitates a breaking away from the older elementalism. But it is usually very difficult for any given individual to break away from the older elementalism, as it involves the established semantic reactions, and to be effective is by necessity a little laborious. The working tool of psychophysiology is found in the semantic reaction. This can be described as the psychological reaction of a given individual to words and language and other symbols and events in connection with their meanings, and the psychological reactions which become meanings and relational configurations. The moment the given individual begins to analyze them, or somebody else does that for him, it is of great importance to realize that the term semantic is non-elementalistic, as it involves conjointly the emotional as well as the intellectual factors. From the non-elementalistic point of view, any effect or impulse, or even human instinct, when made conscious, acquires non-elementalistic meanings and becomes ultimately a psychological configuration of desirable or undesirable to the individual relations, thus revealing a workable non-elementalistic mechanism. Psychotherapy, by making the unconscious conscious and by verbalization, attempts to discover meanings of which the patient was not aware. If the attempt is successful and the individual meanings are revealed, these are usually found to belong to an immature period of evaluation in the patient's life. They are then consciously revised and rejected, and the given patient either improves or is entirely relieved. The condition for a successful treatment seems to be that the processes should be managed in a non-elementalistic way. Mere verbal formalism is not enough, because the full non-elementalistic meanings to the patient are not divulged. Consequently, in such a case, the semantic reactions are not affected, and the treatment is a failure. The non-elementalistic study of the semantic reactions becomes an extremely general scientific discipline. The study of relations, and therefore order, reveals to us the mechanism of non-elementalistic meanings, and in the application of an ordinal physiological discipline, we gain psychophysiological means by which powerfully to affect, reverse, or even annul undesirable semantic reactions. In psychophysiology, we find a non-elementalistic physiological theory of meanings and sanity. From the present point of view, all affective and psychological responses to words and other stimuli involving meanings are to be considered as semantic reactions. what the relation between such responses and a corresponding persistent psychological state may be is at present not clear, although a number of facts of observation seem to suggest that the re-education of the semantic reaction results often in a beneficial change in some of these states, but further investigation in this field is needed. The realization of this difference is important in practice because most of the psychological manifestations may appear as evoked by some event and so are to be called responses or reflexes. Such a response, when lasting, should be called a given state, perhaps a semantic state, but not a semantic reflex. The term semantic reaction will be used as covering both semantic reflexes and states. In the present work, we are interested in semantic reactions from a psychophysiological, theoretical, and experimental point of view, which include the corresponding states. If, for instance, a statement or any event evokes some individual's attention or one train of association in preference to another, or envy or anger or fear or prejudice, etc., we would have to speak of all such responses on psychological levels as semantic reactions. A stimulus was present and a response followed, so that by definition we should speak of a reaction. As the active factor in the stimulus was the individual meaning to the given person, and his response had meanings to him as a first-order effect, the reaction must be called a semantic reaction. The present work is written entirely from the semantic reaction point of view, and so the treatment of the material and the language used imply, in general, a psychological response to a stimulus in connection with meanings, this response being expressed by a number of such words as implies, follows, becomes, evokes, results, feels, reacts, evaluates, and many others. All data taken from science are selected, and only those which directly enter as factors in semantic reactions are given in an elementary outline. The meaning to the individual are dependent through the influence of the environment, education, languages, and in their structure, and other factors on racial meanings called science, which to a large extent, because of the structural and relational character of science, become physiological semantic factors of the reactions. In fact, science, mathematics, logic, etc. may be considered from a non-elementalistic point of view as generalized results of semantic reactions acceptable to the majority of informed and not heavily pathological individuals. To facilitate the writing and the reading of the work, I am compelled to use definite devices, as in case of structure, multi-ordinal terms. So in the case of semantic reactions, I often employ an ordinary form of expression and use the words structural, multi-ordinal, semantic as adjectives, or structurally, semantically as adverbs, always implying the full meanings that under such and such conditions, or of a given stimulus, the given semantic reactions would be such and such. In many instances, the letters semantic reactions or semantic reaction will be inserted to remind the reader that we deal with the semantic reactions of the psychological reactions in connection with the meanings of the problems analyzed. It is not only useful, but perhaps essential, that the reader should stop in such places and try to evoke in himself the given semantic reaction. The present work leads to new semantic reactions which are beneficial to every one of us and fundamental for sanity. The casual reading of the present book is not enough. Anyone who wants the full or partial benefit of the joint labors of the author and the reader must, even in the reading, begin to retain his semantic reactions. As the organism works as a whole, and as the training is psychophysiological in terms of order, reversing the reversed pathological order, etc., organism as a whole means must be employed. For this purpose, the structural differential has been developed. The reader will later understand that it is practically impossible to achieve without its help the maximum beneficial semantic results. From a non-elementalistic point of view, which makes illegitimate any elementalistic verbal splitting of emotions and intellect, etc., these processes must be analyzed in terms of order, indicating the stages of the psychoneural process as a whole. Empirically, there is a difference between an emotion, which becomes rationalized, and emotions invoked or produced by ideas. The order is different in each instance, and if in a given nervous system, at a given moment, or under some special conditions, the lower or higher nerve centers work defectively, the nervous reactions are not well balanced, and the manifestations acquire a one-sided character. The aspect is not abolished, but is simply less prominent or less effective. Thus, in morons, imbeciles, and in many forms of infantilism, the thinking is very emotional and of a low grade. In so-called moral imbeciles, and perhaps in schizophrenia, the thinking may be seemingly normal, yet it does not affect the feelings, which are deficient. From the non-elementalistic semantic human point of view, any effect only gains meanings when it is conscious, or in other words, when an actual or assumed set of relations is present. In an ideally balanced and efficient human nervous system, the emotions would be translated into ideas, and ideas translated into emotions with equal facility. In other words, the semantic reactions of a given individual would be under full control and capable of being educated, influenced, transformed quickly and efficiently, the very reverse of the present situation. The present inquiry shows that the lack of psychophysiological methods for training and the lack of analysis and understanding of the factors involved are responsible for this deplorable situation. The above processes are quite obvious on racial grounds. If we study science and mathematics from the semantic point of view, with very few exceptions, we only fail individually. For instance, a Euclid and a Newton had hunches, intuitions, etc. Then they rationalized and verbalized them, and so affected the rest of us, and established the natural feeling for Euclidean geometries, Newtonian mechanics. When the non-Euclidean or non-Newtonian systems were produced, many of the older scientists could understand them, could even master the new symbolic technique, yet their feelings were seldom affected. They thought in the new way, but they continued to feel in the old. Their semantic reactions did not follow fully the transformation of their ideas, and this produced a split personality. Any fundamentally new system involves new semantic reactions, and this is the main difficulty which besets us when we try to master a new system. We must re-educate or change our older semantic reactions. As a rule, the younger generation, which began with the new semantic reactions, has no difficulties with the new systems. Just the opposite, the older semantic reactions become as difficult or impossible to them as the new were to the older generation. To both generations, with the corresponding semantic reactions, the non-habitual semantic reactions are new, no matter what their historical order or how difficult or how simple they are. However, there is an important difference. The newer systems, as for instance the non-Euclidean, non-Newtonian, and the present corresponding non-Aristotelian system, are more general, which means that the newer systems include the older as particular cases, so that the younger generation has semantic reactions which are more flexible, more conditional, with a broader outlook, etc. Semantic conditions absent in the older systems. The problem connected with the semantic reactions are not new because these are inherent in man. No matter on what low or primitive level or on what high level of development he may be, but up to the understanding of the present analysis, the problems of the semantic reactions were not formulated, their psychophysiological mechanisms were not discovered, and so, to the detriment of all of us, we have had no workable educational means by which to handle them effectively. That is why the passing from one era to another is usually so difficult and so painful. The new involves new semantic reactions, while as a rule the older generations have enforced their systems and through them by means of controlled education and linguistic structure and habits, the old semantic reactions. This, the younger generation, always having more racial experience, cannot accept, so that revolutions, scientific or otherwise, happen, and when successful, the new systems are imposed on the older generation without the older generations changing their semantic reaction, all of which is painful to all concerned. The next generation, after such a revolution, does not have similar difficulties because from childhood they're trained in the new semantic reactions and all appears as natural to them, and the older as unthinkable, silly, etc. As a descriptive fact, the present stage of human development is such that, with a very few exceptions, our nervous systems do not work properly in accordance with their survival structure. In other words, although we have the potentialities for correct functioning in our nervous system because of the neglect of our physiological control mechanism of our semantic reactions, we have semantic blockages in our reactions, and the more beneficial manifestations are very effectively prevented. The present analysis divulges a powerful mechanism for the control and education of semantic reactions, and by means of proper evaluation, a great many undesirable manifestations on the psychological level can be very efficiently transformed into highly desirable ones. In dealing with such a fundamental experimental issue as the semantic reaction, which have been with us since the dawn of mankind, it is impossible to say new things all the time. Very often the issues involved become common sense, but what is the use in practice of this common sense if it is seldom, if ever, applied, and in fact cannot be applied because of the older lack of workable psychophysiological formulations? For instance, what could be simpler or more common sense than the non-Aristotelian premise that an object is not words, yet to my knowledge no one fully applies this or has fully acquired the corresponding semantic reaction. Without first acquiring this new semantic reaction, it is impossible to discover this error and corresponding semantic reaction in others. But as soon as we have trained ourselves, it becomes so obvious that it is impossible to miss it. We shall see later that the older semantic reactions were due to the lack of structural investigations, to the old structure of language, to the lack of consciousness of abstracting, to the low-order conditionality of our conditional reactions, the semantic included, and a long list of other important factors. All scientific discoveries involve semantic reactions, and so, once formulated and the new reactions acquired, the discoveries become common sense. And we often wonder why these discoveries were so slow in coming in spite of their obviousness. These explanations are given because they also involve some semantic reactions, and we must warn the reader that such evaluations, or semantic reactions, a platitude, a baby knows that, are very effective semantic reactions to prevent the acquisition of the new reactions. This is why the discovery of the obvious is often so difficult. It involves very many of semantic factors of new evaluation and meanings. A fuller evaluation is only reached at present on racial grounds in 2 or more generations, and never on individual grounds, which of course for personal generalized adjustment and happiness is very detrimental. Similarly, only in the study of racial achievements called science and mathematics can we discover the appropriate semantic reactions and the nervous mechanism of these so varied, so flexible, and so fundamental reactions. In fact, without a structural formulation and a non-Aristotelian revision based on the study of science and mathematics, it is impossible to discover, to control, or to educate these semantic reactions. For this reason, it was necessary to analyze the semantic factors in connection with brief and elementary considerations taken from modern science. But when all is said and done, and the important semantic factors discovered, the whole issue becomes extremely simple and easily applied, even by persons without much education. In fact, because the objective levels are not words, the only possible aim of science is to discover structure, which when formulated is always simple and easily understood by everyone, with the exception, of course, of very pathological individuals. We have already seen that structure is to be considered as a configuration of relations, and that relations appear as the essential factors in meanings, and so of semantic reactions. The present inquiry, because structural, reveals vital factors of semantic reactions. The consequences are extremely simple, yet very important. We see that by a simple structural re-education of semantic reactions, which in the great mass of people are still on the level of copying animals in their nervous reactions, we powerfully affect the semantic reaction and so are able to impart very simply to all in the most elementary education of the semantic reaction of a child cultural results at present sometimes acquired unconsciously and painfully in university education. The above considerations have forced upon me the structure of the present work and the selection and presentation of the material. Of course, the reader can skip many parts and at once plunge into part 7, and discover that it is all childishly simple, obvious, and common sense. Such a reader or a critic with this particular semantic reaction would miss the point, which can be verified as an experimental fact in the meantime, that in spite of its seeming simplicity, no one, not even the greatest genius, fully applies these platitudes outside of his special work, which semantic reaction in his limited field represents the semantic components that makes up his genius. The full acquisition of the new semantic reactions requires special training, but when acquired, it solves for a given individual without any outside interference all important human problems I know of, and imparts to him some of the semantic reactions of so-called genius, and thus enlarges his so-called intelligence. The problems of the structure of a given language are of extreme and as yet unrealized semantic importance. Thus, for instance, the whole Einstein theory or any other fundamental scientific theory must be considered as the building of a new language of similar structure to the empirical facts known at a given date. In 1933, the general tendency of science, as made particularly obvious in the works of J. Loeb, C.M. Child, Psychiatry, the Einstein theory, the new quantum mechanics, etc., and the present work, is to build languages which take into consideration the many important invariant relations, a condition made possible only by the use of non-elementalistic languages. And in my case, I must construct a non-elementalistic language in which senses and mind, emotions and intellect, etc., are no longer to be verbally split, because a language in which they are split is not similar in structure to the known empirical facts, and all speculations in such an elementalistic language must be misleading. This non-elementalistic language involves a new non-elementalistic theory of meanings, as just explained. The term semantically, semantic reactions, semantic states, etc., are non-elementalistic, as they involve both emotions and intellect, since they depend on meanings, evaluation, significance, and the like, based on structure, relations, and ultimately multi-dimensional order. All these terms apply equally to senses and to mind, to emotions and to intellect. They are not artificially split. It is important to preserve the non-elementalistic or organism as a whole attitude and terminology throughout because these represent most important factors in our semantic reactions. Sometimes it is necessary to emphasize the origin or the relative importance of a given aspect of the impulse or reaction, or to translate for the reader a language not entirely familiar to him into one to which he is more accustomed. In such cases, I use the old elementalistic terms in quotation marks to indicate that I do not eliminate or disregard the other aspects, a disregard which otherwise would be implied by the use of the old terms. The term psychological will always be used either with a hyphen to indicate its non-elementalistic character, or in quotation marks without a hyphen when we refer to the old elementalism. Similarly with the terms psychologics or psychologicians for psychology and psychologists, the terms mental ills, mental hygiene are unfortunate ones since they are used by the majority as elementalistic psychiatrists. It is true use them in the organism as a whole sense to include emotions because of the great semantic influence of the structure of language on the masses of mankind, leading as it does through lack of better understanding and evaluation to speculation on terms. It seems advisable to abandon completely terms which imply to the many the suggested elementalism, although these terms are used in a proper non-elementalistic way by the few. If specialists, to satisfy their semantic reaction, disregard these issues and persist in the use of elementalistic terms, or use such expressions as man is an animal and the like, they misunderstand the importance of semantic factors. Through lack of appreciation or of proper evaluation of the problems involved, they artificially and most effectively prevent the rest of us from following their work without being led astray by the inappropriate structure of their language. The harm done through such practices is quite serious and at present mostly disregarded. For this reason, I either use quotation marks on the terms mental or mental ills, mental hygiene, or else, etc., or else I use the terms psychological, semantic ills, psychological, or semantic hygiene, etc. The above two terms are not only non-elementalistic, but also have an important advantage of being international. The terms effective are little used outside of scientific literature, where they are used mostly in the non-elementalistic ordinal sense. I use them in a similar way without quotation marks. All the issues involved in the present work are, of necessity, interconnected. Thus, order leads to relations, relations to structure, and these in turn to non-elementalistic meanings and evaluations, which are the fundamental factors of all psychological states and responses, called more specifically semantic reactions, states, and reflexes. The reader should be careful to remain at all times aware of these connections and implications. Whenever we find order or relations or structure in the outside world or in our nervous system, these terms, because of their non-elementalistic character, imply similar order, relations, and structure in our psychological processes, thus establishing meaning, proper evaluations, etc., ultimately leading towards appropriate semantic reactions. The reverse applies also. Whenever we speak of semantic reactions, non-elementalistic meanings, structure, relations, and finally order are implied. The use of non-elementalistic languages is seriously beneficial as it is structurally more correct and establishes semantic reactions which are more appropriate, more flexible, or of higher order conditionality, a necessity for the optimum working of the human nervous system, all of which results follow automatically from the structure of the language used. A non-elementalistic, structurally correct but non-formulated attitude is a private benefit. Once it is formulated in a non-elementalistic language, it becomes a public benefit as it induces in others the non-elementalistic attitudes, thus transforming the former semantic reactions. In this way, a feeling has been translated structurally into language, which in turn, through structure, involves other people's attitudes and feelings, and so their semantic reactions. The whole process is extremely simple, elementary and automatic, yet before we acquire the new semantic reaction, we find difficulties because of the fundamental novelty of these reactions. Any persistent student will acquire them easily, provided he does not expect too rapid a progress. The subject matter of the present analysis is closely related to the feelings of everybody, yet the difficulties in acquiring the new reactions are similar to those the older scientists found in acquiring the semantic reactions necessary for mastering the non-Euclidean and non-Newtonian systems. In physics, we often need space-like or time-like intervals, although the non-elementalistic implications of the term interval remain. Similarly, in our problems, when we are interested in the emotion-like or mind-like aspects of the non-elementalistic semantic reactions, we shall indicate the special aspects by using the old terms in quotation marks. This method prevents wasteful and futile speculations on elementalistic terms, and serves as a reminder that the other aspects are present, although in a given discussion we do not deem them to be important. The above has by itself very far-reaching semantic influence of our reactions. From what has already been said, it is clear that the terminology of semantic reactions, etc., covers in a non-elementalistic way all psychological reactions, which were formerly covered by elementalistic terms of emotions and intellect, the reactions themselves always being on the objective levels and unspeakable, as semantic reactions can always be analyzed into terms of meanings and evaluation, and the latter into terms of structure, relations, and multidimensional order, which involves physiological factors. The term semantic ultimately appears as a physiological, or rather psychophysiological term. It suggests workable and simple educational methods, which will be explained later. The reader should notice that the use of a language of a new structure has led to new results, which in turn directly affect our semantic reactions. An important point should be stressed, namely that the issues are fundamentally simple, because they are similar in structure to the structure of human knowledge, and to the nervous structure on which so-called human nature depends. Because of this similarity, it is unconditionally necessary to become fully acquainted with the new terms of new structure, and to use them habitually. Only then will the beneficial results follow. All language have some structure, and so all languages involve automatically the, of necessity, interconnected semantic reaction. Anyone who tries to translate the new language into the old while thinking in the older terms is confronted with an inherent neurological difficulty and involves himself in a hopeless confusion of his own doing. The reader must be warned against making this mistake. In the present work, I have tried to realize fully my duties towards my reader, and I am certain that the reader who will read the book diligently and repeatedly will be repaid for his labors. The realization that some problems do exist, even if we do not fully appreciate or understand them, has very serious semantic influences on all of us. Realizing my responsibilities toward the reader, I have not spared difficult labor in order to bring these semantic facts to his attention. I seriously suggest that no reader ought to disregard parts 8, 9, and 10, but that he should become at least acquainted with the existence of the problems there discussed. If this is conscientiously done, many beneficial semantic reactions will appear sooner or later. The present system is an interconnected whole. The beginning implies the end, and the end implies the beginning. Because of this characteristic, the book should be read at least twice and preferably oftener. I wish positively to discourage any reader who intends to give it merely a superficial reading. The problems of semantic reactions have not, so far, been analyzed at all from the point of view of structure, and the present inquiry is, as far as my knowledge goes, the first in existence. The problems of meanings are vast, extremely important, and very little analyzed. The interested reader will find some material in the excellent critical review of the problems of meanings in Ogden's and Richard's, the meaning of meaning in some parts of Baldwin's Thought and Things or Genetic Logic, and in Lady Welby's article in the Encyclopedia Britannica on significs. In these three studies, a partial literature of the subject is given. The present work involves issues taken from many and diverse branches of knowledge which have not hitherto been seen to be connected. What is of importance is that the issues presented should be sound in the main, even if not perfect in details, which often have no bearing on the subject. Specialists in the field here analyzed should pass their professional judgment as to the soundness of their special parts of the system. They do not need even to be enthusiastic. It is enough if they approve it. The main issue is the building of a non-Aristotelian system, which coordinates many disconnected fields of knowledge on the basis of structure, from the special point of view of non-elementalistic semantic reactions. If these results have been accomplished, the author is satisfied. Section B. On the unspeakable objective level. The term unspeakable expresses exactly that which we have up to now practically entirely disregarded, namely that an object or feeling, say our toothache, is not verbal, is not words. Whatever we may say will not be the objective level, which remains fundamentally unspeakable. Thus, we can sit on the object called a chair, but we cannot sit on the noise we made or the name we applied to that object. It is of utmost importance for the present non-Aristotelian system not to confuse the verbal level with the objective level, the more so that all our immediate and direct mental and emotional reactions and all semantic reactions, states, and reflexes belong to the unspeakable objective levels, as these are not words. This fact is of great but unrealized importance for the training of appropriate semantic reactions. We can train these reactions simply and effectively by silence on the objective levels, using familiar objects called a chair or a pencil, and this training automatically affects our emotions, feelings, as well as other psychological immediate responses difficult to reach, which are also not words. We can train simply and effectively the semantic reactions inside our skins by training on purely objective and familiar grounds outside our skins, avoiding unnecessary psychological difficulties, yet achieving the desired semantic results. The term unspeakable is used in its strict English meaning. The objective level is not words, cannot be reached by words alone, and has nothing to do with good or bad. Neither can it be understood as non-expressible by words or not to be described by words, because the terms expressible or described already presuppose words and symbols. Something, therefore, which we call a chair or a toothache may be expressed or described by words, yet the situation is not altered, because the given description or expression will not be the actual objective level, which we call a chair or a toothache. Semantically, this problem is genuinely crucial. Anyone who misses that, and it is unfortunately easily missed, will miss one of the most important psychological factors in all semantic reaction underlying sanity. This omission is facilitated greatly by the older systems, habits of thought, older semantic reactions, and above all by the primitive structure of our Aristotelian language and the use of the is of identity. Thus, for instance, we handle what we call a pencil. Whatever we handle is unspeakable, yet we say this is a pencil, which statement is unconditionally false to facts, because the object appears as an absolute individual and is not words. Thus, our semantic reactions are at once trained in delusional values, which must be pathological. I shall never forget a dramatic moment in my experience. I had a very helpful and friendly contact prolonged over a number of years with a very eminent scientist. After many discussions, I asked if some of the special points of my work were clear to him. His answer was, "Yes, it is all right," and so on, but how can you expect me to follow your work all through if I still do not know what an object is? It was a genuine shock to me. The use of the little word is as an identity term applied to the objective level had paralyzed most effectively a great deal of hard and prolonged work. Yet the semantic blockage which prevented him from acquiring the new semantic reaction is so simple as to seem trifling, in spite of the semantic harm done. The definite answer may be expressed as follows. Say whatever you choose about the object, and whatever you might say is not it. Or, in other words, whatever you might say the object is, well, it is not. This negative statement is final, because it is negative. I have enlarged upon this subject because of its crucial semantic importance. Whoever misses this point is missing one of the most vital factors of practically all semantic reactions leading toward sanity. The above is easily verified. In my experience, I have never met anyone, even among scientists, who would fully apply this childish wisdom as an instinctive feeling and factor in all his semantic reactions. I want also to show the reader the extreme simplicity of a non-Aristotelian system based on the denial of the is of identity, and to forewarn him against very real difficulties induced by the primitive structure of our language and the semantic reactions connected with it. Our actual lives are lived entirely on the objective levels, and including the unspeakable feelings, emotions, etc., the verbal levels being only auxiliary and effective only if they are translated back into first-order unspeakable effects, such as an object, an action, a feeling, etc., all on the silent and unspeakable objective levels. In all cases of which I know at present, where the retraining of our semantic reactions has had beneficial effects, the results were obtained when this silence on these objective levels has been attained, which affects all our psychological reactions and regulates them to the benefit of the organism and of his survival adaptation. Section C, on copying in our nervous reactions. The selection of the term copying was forced upon me after much meditation. Its standard meaning implies reproduction after a model, applicable even to mechanical processes, and although it does not exclude it, does not necessarily include conscious copying. It is not generally realized to what an important extent copying plays its roles in higher animals and man. Some characteristics are inborn, some are acquired. Long ago, Spalding made experiments with birds. Newly hatched birds were enclosed in small boxes which did not allow them to stretch their wings or to see other birds fly. At the period when usually flying begins, they were released and began to fly at once with great skill, showing that flying in birds is an inborn function. Other experiments were made by Scott to find out if the characteristic song of the oriole was inborn or acquired. When orioles, after being hatched, were kept away from their parents at a given period, they began to sing, but the peculiar melody of their songs was different from the songs of their parents. Thus, singing is an inborn characteristic, but the special melody is due to copying parents, and so is acquired. In our human reactions, speech in general is an inborn characteristic, but what our special language or what special structure of language we acquire is due to environment and copying, much too often to unconscious and therefore uncritical copying. As to the copying of animals in our nervous reactions, this is quite a simple problem. Self-analysis, which is rather a difficult affair, necessitating a serious and efficient mentality, was impossible in the primitive stage. Copying parents, in many respects, began long before the appearance of man, who has naturally continued this practice until the present day. The results, therefore, are intimately connected with reactions of a pre-human stage, transmitted from generation to generation. But for our present purpose, the most important form of the copying of animals was and is the copying of the comparative unconditionality of their conditional reflexes, of lower order conditionality, the animalistic identification or confusion of orders of abstractions, and the lack of consciousness of abstracting, which, while natural, normal, and necessary with animals, becomes a source of endless semantic disturbances for humans. More about copying will be explained as we proceed. It should be noticed also that because of the structure of the nervous system and the history of its development, the more an organism became conscious, the more this copying became a neurological necessity, as exemplified in parrots and apes. With man, owing to the lack of consciousness of abstracting, his copying capacities became also much more pronounced and often harmful. Even the primitive man and the child are intelligent enough to observe and copy, but not informed enough in the racial experiences, usually called science, which for him are non-existent, to discriminate between the reactions on the psychological levels of animals and the typical responses which man with his more complex nervous system should have. Only an analysis of structure and semantic reactions resulting in consciousness of abstracting can free us from this unconscious copying of animals, which, let us repeat, must be pathological for man because it eliminates a most vital regulating factor in human nervous and semantic reactions, and so vitiates the whole process. This factor is not simply additive, so that when it is introduced and superimposed on any response of the human nervous system, allowing such superimposition, the whole reaction is fundamentally changed in a beneficial way.